Now it's time to talk about what happened in Century City.
No.
1967. Hey, LBJ, what exactly happened that time you came to LA? The year's the 1960s.
Yes.
Incense. Peppermints. Oh my God, the president's been shot! Taking over for that dead president was a man named Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Oh, LBJ, I don't like you.
And in 1967, he was gearing up to get some fundraising to plant the seeds for his re-election campaign. As many presidents do, he decided to come to the home of loose funds and public influence to do this, Los Angeles. There was going to be a $1,000 per plate fundraising dinner in his honor at the Century Plaza Hotel at 2025 Avenue of the Stars in Century City. It's across from the Annenberg Space for Photography.
Oh, yeah.
In case you're wondering. This hotel opened only the year before in 1966 and was the apex of luxury in the city. So many presidents ended up staying there over the years that it was nicknamed the Western White House. But like old-timey Western, like Back to the Future 3.
Saloon? Yeah. Like Back to the Future 3.
In 1969, this was even where Nixon had a party. Nixon likes to party. I like to cut a rug with the youngest of them.
My +1 is my surfboard.
So Nixon had a party in 1969 for the Apollo 11 astronauts after they got back from the moon, still smelling like cheese. And I don't smell like cheese, if that's what you're wondering. This particular dinner in 1967 would include some of the most powerful people in the city and would have a live performance by the Supremes.
Oh, fun. I want to go to that.
Yeah, it's only $1,000 and you get dinner.
Oh, yeah.
And you get to walk into a hotel. That's priceless. Sounds like a pretty good time.
Yeah.
You know, I'd do
have
it.
a good time, yeah.
I'd elect a murderer. Unfortunately, something called NAM was going on at the time.
Viet?
The Viets. It was happening. The war in Viets had been going on for over 10 years already at this point, which did you know the Vietnam War was like 20 years long?
Yeah.
It's weird.
It's awful.
Although we're living through something similar right now.
It'll never end.
I hope not. So it was going on for about over 10 years at this point, but public opinion wasn't really that against it yet. It didn't happen.
Not everybody knew someone who was dead yet.
No.
That was another
yet.
2 years, and then suddenly everybody knew someone who was dead.
Yeah. So this was years before Kent State, 2 or 3 years before Kent State, and there really were not many protests against the Vietnam War. But two guys, Irving Sarnoff and Donald Kalish, decided to use this opportunity to publicly demonstrate their group, the Peace Action Council's opposition to the war in front of the president while he was in town.
Cool move, guys.
So they filed for a parade permit during the time of the planned dinner.
That's just a funny sentence to me. Every parade to me, I think it happens like the thing.
Spontaneously?
I think it happens like the end of Animal House where it's just like, ramming speed! And then you suddenly have a protest. Like, I forget that you have to fill out forms and get police to like, hey, can you not beat us up this day?
Not today,
Not
please.
today, please.
Well, today wasn't that day. You'll find out.
Okay.
They planned for it during the dinner, and the route was to start at the Cheviot Hills Park, go up Pico.
Have a nice little lunch, a tuna sandwich, and then we're going to march.
Nothing gets you going more than a nice tuna sandwich. You go up Pico, turn left onto the Avenue of the Stars, pass by the hotel, and then end on Santa Monica. The hotel went to court the day before the march to stop it from happening, but no luck. It's too late. The wheels are in motion. You can't stop a parade.
Yeah, that's a squeaky wheel.
So in the afternoon of June 23rd, 1967, people began to gather in the park to get ready for the march. There were all sorts of people gathered there. Hippies, commies, church people, my three favorites. A lot of different activist groups joined in. Some were militant, some were not. But the most notable characteristic of the crowd was that it was mostly middle-class white people who wanted to have their opinion on the war known. Many of them brought their kids with them, you know. It'll be your first protest.
Yeah.
And what a protest. Many of these kids were under 10 years old.
Oh, no.
So it was like young families. So the crowd was gathered, and there were a few speakers, including Benjamin Spock, live long and prosper. He's the guy who wrote the Common Sense book of baby and child care. H. Rap Brown, who is the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and convicted draft dodger Muhammad Ali came to talk to them.
Cool. Cassius Clay came?
Well, he changed his name to avoid the draft.
High five, dude. Any way to get out of it. I wouldn't go. I've seen the footage. I ain't going.
You can't make me. I'm not going. I'll never go to Vietnam.
I'll go to France. I'll be an expatriate, which is just a fancy title for an immigrant.
So then, around 7:30 p.m., the march began. As they walked down the streets, more people joined the march, and their numbers started to swell.
Cool.
Then they got in front of the hotel, where the cops had set up a barricade, which cut down the 4 lanes they were marching in to 1 lane, and it caused a very serious bottleneck.
I don't like this. I already see smoke in my head.
It's about to get very scary.
Single file, we want to beat you in order. Factory style beating.
And then somewhere around 25 to 100 of the marchers decided to stage a sit-in in front of the hotel, and they sat down on the street. And that's when things started to get ugly.
Fudgesicles.
Holy smoky Robinson. But let's take a step back to see this from the other side's point of view. Even though there wasn't much anti-Vietnam stuff going on yet, the Watts riot did happen just 2 years before this, so LA's attitudes towards big crowds of people with a purpose was a little bit wary.
They could burn down the auditorium to scare everybody like they did in the Watts riots.
That's a talk for another episode. And having a president coming to town only 4 years after JFK was killed, the LAPD was on high alert and wanted to protect the president at any cost to prevent getting the dark mark that Dallas will always have to be ashamed of. They let a president die.
They let a president die.
So the LA...
We told you no book depositories in Texas and you wouldn't listen!
We thought nobody read there. What is this? I guess they just keep their guns there. So the LAPD was determined to keep LBJ safe. And it's not like their fears were unfounded because Robert Kennedy got assassinated the next year in LA.
I just did the sign of the cross. Nobody saw me.
On top of that, Sarnoff, the organizer, had been called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1958, and he had refused to answer any other questions when it was labeled a communist.
Good for you.
So he was under investigation.
Snitches get stitches.
Yeah.
Seriously, what were the names of those guys that you knew?
Listen to last month's episode to learn what a communist is.
Yes.
The Century Plaza Hotel hired 4 private agents from a company called International Investigation System to infiltrate...
Ooh, don't like that. Any of those words I don't like.
The planning committee of this march to get information to feed to the LAPD so they could keep tabs and be prepared for whatever they might have planned. The secret agents reported back to the LAPD that the marchers had plans to release mice and cockroaches into the hotel and use stink and smoke bombs, which I swear I didn't swallow a stink bomb. It's natural skunk musk. Break in, grab the president, and either kidnap him or kill him. I don't know.
Okay.
What the agents didn't report to the LAPD is that these plans were quickly rejected and that the march was meant to be non-violent.
Did they not mention that this was actually a gag for a Bugs Bunny cartoon?
Yeah.
Did they not mention that it's Warner Brothers material?
Oh no, they went into the wrong office. What they really didn't mention was that, as maintained by some of the organizers, that these agents themselves were the ones who were suggesting these violent and weird acts.
Wow.
Presumably so that they could get the group to go along with it and make them incriminate themselves and give the LAPD reason to arrest them.
Jesus.
So because of this, the LAPD was prepared for something they thought was going to be a lot more dangerous than it was, with a credible plot to kill the president using stink bombs.
Okay, picture this. He'll get enough of it in his nostrils and then he'll run into something and maybe he'll clonk his head or whatever.
He needs fresh air. The president needs fresh air. It can't be stinky in there. So what they weren't prepared for was the size of the march when it arrived. LA wasn't known for having big protests at the time. This was before the walkouts and all that, the blowouts, sorry. And the police chief expected there to be around 2,000 people, mostly students. So when the police chief looked out of the 9th floor window at the hotel and saw a crowd of 10,000 people and a pile-up forming near the front of the hotel where the police barricade was, especially since their permit was for a parade, so they weren't allowed to stop, he gave the order to the officers to disperse them. So now we go back down onto the street.
Thin the numbers!
Call them! Call them! The cops at the bottleneck of the march started giving orders for the protesters to disperse. Problem was, they were fenced in by police barricades all around, so there was nowhere to go. On top of that, the people further back couldn't hear the orders, so they kept coming, and the traffic jam got bigger and bigger and bigger. Then more people, not being able to move, they were like, well, let's just sit down. So then they started sitting down. Then people towards the back who didn't know what was happening started to sing like the Star Spangled Banner and things like that, and that eventually sort of like Game of Telephone style made its way to the front through the crowd, and it turned into chants of "We are the people, we are the people." Meanwhile, the cops kept telling people to leave, but people either couldn't hear them or they couldn't move, so nothing was happening, and then the blue line was activated.
Oh no.
1,300 cops in riot gear were mobilized, and they began to push in on the crowd. And of these 1,300, about 500 of them took it upon themselves to get a little violent. violent.
I haven't whacked anything all year. I gotta meet my quota.
Old Billy Club's coming out to play.
William Club.
William B. Club. So as the crowd got compressed more and more by the cops, there was less and less space for people to move. So to remedy that, the cops began beating people. They pushed and prodded whoever was in their way. People were falling over and getting trampled, and it wasn't just adults. Like, that's the worst part of this. There were cops seen hitting children, seniors, and disabled people. There was, God, I read horrible stories. There was one, this woman was like with her younger kid who had some sort of like tumor on his brain or something and couldn't walk well. And the cops kept pushing them, and the mom was like, don't. Like, my son has something going on with him. Don't stop pushing him. And they kept pushing. The kid fell over, and they started stomping on the kid. God. And the mom threw herself on them, begging him, don't hit him in the head. You could kill him. And they just beat them both.
Oh, my God.
The whole thing, it quickly descended into pandemonium. The cops pretty much like sheepdogs barking, trying to corral all the protesters back. Some other incidents that happened. There's an underpass under the Avenue of the Stars on Olympic Boulevard that a bunch of people ran into for refuge from the cops that were pushing down the Avenue of the Stars, which at this point was quickly renamed the Avenue of Seeing Stars.
The Avenue of the Scars.
People were safe down there for a while, and then the cops showed up in cars and motorcycles, and they began to drive into the crowd, and people had to literally jump out of the way to not get run over. Then once the cars
Somebody
left...
call the cops. Oh, no.
Call the president. Oh, no. Then once the cars left, a line of cops came marching through. In protest, 4 young people sat down in the middle of the street. The cops started marching towards them. Then a few of them broke off, ran at the 4 people sitting there unarmed, and started to beat them furiously. Jesus. One of them was a woman. One witness said they saw one of the billy clubs fly 10 feet in the air out of the cop's hand. They were hitting them so ferociously. 2 of them managed to straggle away, but 2 were left unconscious on the road. Some of the people beaten in this march had ambulances called for them by the cops. Some were given like minor attention and then like, you're fine, go home. But the majority of them were just beaten and left there.
I imagine LBJ standing in the hotel like on the 9th floor like, good.
Is there any more Jell-O? I paid $1,000 for this. A group of marchers were forced across the Beverly Hills city limits where the LAPD couldn't follow them, and then there was this sort of face-off between the protesters and the cops with the boundary line dividing them. Just like, jeery, I'm jeering at you. And then the LAPD crossed the border and attacked them.
We'll fill out the paperwork later.
One guy was driving on the outskirts of this whole mess at Motor and Pico, and he saw some cops beating a woman, and he stopped and he demanded the cop's badge number. Then I presume the cop said, I'll give you a badge number. And he pulled the man out of the car, proceeded to beat him while another cop got into his car and parked it so as not to impede the traffic.
Good. And then he gave him a ticket because he parked in the red.
Meanwhile, back in the hotel, the president almost had to be evacuated by helicopter out of the city. Yeah.
Poor guy. I would hate you to get blood on your nice suit.
Mr. President, you're going to have to take this meal to go. The Supremes, they're not going to play one fine day.
The Zeppelin's ready. We'll take you.
After about 90 minutes of these atrocities, the frenzy was over. The crowd had been either beaten back into Beverly Hills or back to Cheviot Hills Park. 51 people had been arrested. Many more were injured. Over 500 people filed complaints with the ACLU. On the other side, 4 cops were reported injured, one of which was from a broken blood vessel in his clubbing hand.
Poor guy. He's probably got workman's comp.
The media completely downplayed the severity of what had happened that night.
Cops hurt in protest.
One cop gets a black and blue hand from doing what? I don't know, but don't worry about it. He's a cop. It wasn't until years later, if ever, that this event got the attention that it deserved. After less than a week, with no interviews of any kind of any of the people who had filed complaints, it was decided that the LAPD had taken proper action to remedy the situation. There's still a lot of debate and disagreement on what exactly happened that night and whether or not the police were actually justified in what they did. Even the organizers of the march years later couldn't agree on whether or not some of the radicals in the group set off the police or whether the police just completely unprovoked did this. The deputy LAPD chief was disgusted by how the LAPD had acted. Many of the marchers were angry with the organizers for not warning them that it could turn violent because they brought their 5-year-old kids here. So it sounds like there was a lot of like miscommunication on both sides, but it also seems like portions of both sides were just itching for a fight. Like they really wanted it to turn into what it did. It was a confusing situation, and it was a confusing time for the entire country. It's easy to say that the cops screwed up, and I will, but it's also easy to understand that they wanted to do whatever it took to prevent LA being the city that let the second president in a row get assassinated, which they genuinely seemed to think was a possibility. The march itself was the first of the huge anti-Vietnam War protests and was the first course of what was to come with all that stuff. Yeah. Just as important, this was the first time the police turned on the white middle class.
Yeah.
Like as one reporter said, it was the first time he had ever seen a white woman getting beaten by the police.
Welcome to the club.
It was a turning point for the country. It wasn't just minorities anymore that were being,
Yeah, so they can't stay quiet anymore, right, guys?
Now everyone was involved.
Yeah.
One good thing to come out of this is that LBJ didn't do much public campaigning after this. It's even credited with being the start of his decision to not run for re-election. Meanwhile, on the day that this podcast comes out, March 1st, 2016, the Century Plaza Hotel, which is now the Hyatt Regency Century Plaza, starts its $2.5 billion remodeling that won't be completed till 2018.
See you in 2018.
So if you want to recreate what happened that night in 1967, just trespass into the construction zone, and I'm sure the security guards will be happy to play along with you.
Yeah, they love that.